OH. I did it to see how many Buckeyes I have in the room because two of our friends up here didn't give me the response back. So I know who's in the room now. In the U.S. and the United States, we pride ourselves on being number one at many things. We have the largest foreign investments, the greatest military, with the highest developer of technology, number one in movies, and also the world champion in sports. But we also hold the title for world champs in mass incarceration. The United States constitutes 5% of the world's population, but hosts 23% of its imprisoned population across the globe. Today we have two experts who will provide some commentary on the impact of mass incarceration in the U.S. They will set the table today with about a few comments, worth about 30 minutes. Then we'll have a moderated discussion for 30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A with those who are in attendance today. First, I want to welcome Sarah Wakefield. She's an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University. She is no stranger to the Big Ten, earning her BA in sociology from the University of Minnesota, a master's in sociology from the University of Wisconsin, and she went back home to get her PhD from the University of Minnesota. Her research interests focus on the consequences of mass imprisonment on families, with an emphasis on childhood well-being and racial inequality. She has published a series of articles and books entitled Children of the Prison Boom, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of American Inequality. She also examines the social networks and conditions of confinement of inmates, as well as the influence of DNA databases on crime rates and racial inequality. Let us welcome Professor Wakefield.
Thank you. Thank you.
Townsend Price Spratling is an associate professor of sociology at The Ohio State University. He pulled off an academic trifecta at the University of Washington, earning a BS in psychology, master's in criminology, and PhD in demography at Washington. He is an affiliate with the Criminal Justice Research Center and the Institute for Population Research. He also holds a courtesy appointment with the Department of African American and African Studies. His research interests are urban sociology, criminology, mass incarceration, reentry, religion and health, African American historical demography, social justice, and community organizing. He is well published as well with numerous articles and books, along with two works, Reconstructing Rage, Transformative Reentry in the Era of Mass Incarceration, and Nurturing Sanctuary, Community Capacity Building in African American Churches. We'll start off today with Dr. Price Spratling.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Bennett.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good morning. Glad everybody's here. Came out to hear and address this theme. Not sure how well y'all can see that. I hope you can see it better than I can. But it's clear to y'all. Let's see. Okay. Let me begin by first thanking Piers for asking me to participate in this event, and thanks to Compass for putting this event on. I think it's interesting that we're in a particularly valuable historical moment, and I think there's worth in taking note of the historical moment that we are in. The events that are currently taking place in Charlotte, North Carolina, secondary to a recent police shooting, and what's the point? And this, thank you. And this is calling attention to, what happened a week ago today in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on an interstate. Terrence Crutcher, a 40-year-old African-American man, was driving home, and you can see, if you would choose to, the aerial helicopter police footage that is particularly revealing, especially revealing, because he is asked to put his hands up. He does put his hands up, and yet seconds later, after walking towards his car, he ends up being shot, and that is currently under investigation. So we're having this discussion and this focus on mass incarceration in a very powerfully important and complicated historical moment, and there is value in that exchange. May Mr. Crutcher, young Mr. King, the 13-year-old who was killed in this city just a week ago, may they rest in greater peace than they had, at least in their point of death and closure at the hands of a police bullet. Okay, so my time with you today is to explore mass incarceration in its systemic relationships. So I wanted to call attention to the historical moment and place the systemic relationship within that historical moment. Let's deal with the conference question, when do inequalities matter? When do inequalities matter? Spend a little time considering and placing that question in a historical context. As Professor Emeritus John Henrik Clarke suggested, history is a current event, and we'll explore the relationship and relevance of that important thought. Have a couple comments about where we are now, and then address transformations, which will be the core of our discussion throughout, and then toward a possible future. May we ever be hopeful. This is a rendering of the prison industrial complex put together by the Corrections Documentary Project. As you can see, it's a complex that places prisons and jails at the core, if you will, of a set of broader systemic relationships. Everything from prison guard unions to politicians in the current moment that we are in a presidential year, big industry and corporations, and the private prison system, private prisons, which we will collectively talk about, and I'll mention briefly, along with a variety of other components therein. When do inequalities matter? At all times, at all levels, across multiple dimensions of this broader complex of relationships that we're exploring today. So, every domain of the complex, all of the time. Let's place that relevance of inequalities in a historical context. On the historical foundations of mass incarceration as a contemporary moment, yes, it can be understood secondary to President Richard Nixon in building up a campaign for his re-election in 1971, uttering the phrase that the public enemy number one is the war on drugs. Yes, from that point forward, it became a movement from a federal and presidential level, and was instituted into policy, trickled down to various state policies across the Reagan era, and the explosion of the Clinton administration, the prison build president. More prison units were built under President Bill Clinton than any other presidency in United States history. What is mass incarceration in the contemporary context should be placed in a slave context. Here we see an image of white citizens leagues, the political body, in handshake with the organization, the Ku Klux Klan, in its relationship to an understanding of being worse than slavery. This was a recognition and an articulation of the ways in which the black codes and Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction actually imposed significant hardship that in the eyes of some were worse than chattel slavery. That's a historical conversation to be had. Whether that marker is correct, it's just an acknowledgement that the peculiar institution of chattel slavery was about the criminalization of the black body. And it's actually written into our founding fathers' statutes through the fugitive slave law. So the criminalization of the black body is about the founding of this country, is rooted very directly in the founding of this country. Its criminalization has been substance connected for well over a century. This is a New York Times article from 1914 in which you can see the headline, "Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace." So there was a recognition of the connection, and read the byline, "Murder and insanity increase among lower class blacks because they have taken to sniffing since deprived of whiskey by prohibition." So there's a connection in the article of a racialization with a substance secondary to the imposition of prohibition, which was, as I hope we know, an abject failure of an effort on the part of the United States to prohibit alcohol sales and distribution, which actually gave rise to an explosion in the proliferation of organized crime. But I just want to acknowledge the criminalization of the black body in relationship to substances goes back at least a century, and related to persons of color going back at least to 1875 and the San Francisco law that outlawed the smoking of opium in direct connection to Chinese immigrants. So the commodification of peoples of color related to substances is not new, going back at least to 1914, going back to 1875 on the part of San Francisco law. Okay, so historical criminalization is about the criminalization of the body of groups and peoples of color. It's manifest in contemporary times in a variety of ways, and I just want to give one particular example. For comparable crimes and charges, for comparable convictions, African Americans are given 20% longer sentences. So the black men receive prison sentences 19.5% longer than those of white men who committed similar crimes. Crimes are being compared, and African Americans are given longer sentences for those comparable crimes. So that's in the contemporary landscape. And true to the comment, where are we now? Where are we now? That historical context gives rise to current criminal procedure and charging and overcharging or over-sentencing of African Americans relative to their white counterparts. And as was mentioned earlier, the United States is the global leader. This is a bar chart from the International Center for Prison Studies, 2010 data, and it demonstrates that the United States is the global leader in incarceration. And one more point, I think there are multiple, but among them, if we are the company we keep, and there's a great deal of finger pointing toward particular nation states, let's acknowledge that a totalitarian capitalism of China is here by comparison, and the only nation states that come close to the United States level are Russia and Rwanda. So if we are the company we keep, then there's worth in acknowledging the relationship of the United States in its global leadership in incarceration. So United States, 5% of the globe's population, 25% of the globe's prisoners. So an over-representation of at least a rate of about 5 to 1. Okay, and that criminalization also relates to, back to the commodification, the connection of peoples of color with particular substances. This is a chart that it demonstrates from U.S. Department of Justice data, along with data from the Department of Health and Human Services, that the share of all illegal drug users is basically proportional to population. The share of illegal drug users is basically proportional to population. This is a white share of illegal drug users at 66.3. The African American share of illegal drug users at about 12.6. Again, about proportionate to the population. But compared to the share of inmates in state and federal prisons convicted of drug offenses, African Americans make up over half, whereas whites 30.4%. So more than a cutting of half, and basically a 4 times the rate relative to participation of or consumption of illegal drugs. So overrepresentation, continued commodification from the historical into the contemporary. That's how mass incarceration functions, heavily driven by this process and these inequities. So where are we now? In a need of profound transformation, a need of profound transformation. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the award-winning writer, thinker, and just incredible individual, has recently suggested the criminal justice system is not broken. It's actually functioning very much as it is intended to. Commodifying individuals for intended marginalization and enriching a level of sort of slow growth genocide. So I just want to acknowledge that that's highly charged language, but I think there's worth in at least considering its relevance. We are now at a point and moment from 2008 forward where there's been a gradual, slow decline in state prison populations in the aggregate. And it actually went up a bit in 2013. That gradual decline, we're in an era of gradual decline. We're in an era in which state after state are raising questions regarding the fiscal sustainability of our current incarceration. It's not fiscally sustainable. So what are strategies toward reducing the burden on the state? So America is finally closing prisons. Finally, from 2008 forward, basically. Now what do we do with them? And I think there's great worth in simply raising the question, what are the ways in which we, into the future, retrofit justice, retrofit a broader justice? There will be, hopefully, ghost town prisons that let's vision possibilities beyond today. There will conceivably be closed prisons and ghost town places where Emily Badger discussed and considered what might be done with these ghost town things that are typically in small town and rural America. What is to be done with them? And there's a whole discussion, a niche within this larger literature that talks about formal retrofitting, getting in touch with folks over at the Knowlton School and other similar places for redesign for habitability outside of total institutions. And we can talk about that. There's one outside of DC that's actually, where there's effort to turn it into a mall. Another one outside of, in the state of Virginia, where there's effort to build an area adjacent to it so that it can become an actual residential space for civilian residential space. An apartment building. So, it's voluntary residential space. So I just think there's great value in the willingness to raise the question, what do we do with these spaces toward retrofitting a broader justice? And toward that end, I want to spend a little time acknowledging what Reconstructing Rage is, an effort to explore the meaning of that retrofitting. What are the ways in which grassroots community organizations founded of, by, and for former felons, recognizing them, returning citizens as a critical resource, a vital resource in that transformation moving forward. Reconstructing Rage explores, is an organizational ethnography focusing on a single organization in a single city, in a single neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. North Philadelphia, for any folks who know Philadelphia. The Tioga neighborhood, not too far from, just northwest of Temple University. And Reconstruction Incorporated is that organization. Reconstruction was founded on the idea of the sacred circle, meaning it's of, by, and for returning citizens, their families, and interested others, and the circle as a symbol and its visual and symbolic equity is sacred within the context of and cultural traditions of both continental African and First Nation cultural traditions. There's a prioritization of shared respect, reciprocity, and consensus building. Reconstruction came out of there's a much longer history that we don't have time for, but I just want to give you a feel and flavor for retrofitting a broader justice informed by this symbolic engagement in actions and decisions and the how of the organization moving forward in view of the historical and contemporary landscape that I just described. It came out of, began as an initiative with the American Friends Service Committee, for anybody who knows the Quaker tradition or history. AFSC is in essence the social justice arm of the Society of Friends, which is a long-standing Quaker tradition, a faith community of going back to the very origins of this country. Reconstruction opened its doors in 1988, became incorporated as an independent 501c3 in 1991, and has functioned steadily since that time. It operates in a neighborhood that Todd Clear and others Jeremy Travis have called imprisoned communities, communities marked by significant disparities relative to the city and with the larger city in which they reside. Here are the characteristics of Philadelphia 2010 data. 41% African American, 10% bachelor's degrees, 22% in poverty. Within the neighborhood that Reconstruction functions in, 94% African American, 3.5% of the neighborhood population with bachelor's degrees, a poverty rate that is substantially greater, nearly twice the city's poverty rate, and with both violent and drug-related crimes, basically almost 2 to 1 relative to the city as a whole. Yet, in this neighborhood, a 3-pillar curriculum functions. It is a response in a way to the James Lynch, a quality criminologist who explores criminal justice policies. And he's raised the question, can specific programs or organizational initiatives affect levels of social integration among released persons enough to affect the quality of life for them and their family and to reduce their criminal involvement? Can organizations and programs contribute to successful desistance, where individuals re-enter society and lead and sustain crime-free lives? Short answer is yes, and Reconstruction is one demonstration thereof. 3 pillars of the organizational curriculum focus on leadership development, situation management, and support group development. I want to call attention to one component within these 3 pillars, placing value within the leadership development pillar, entailing understanding the principles and processes of 4 critical themes, moving from alienation to the building and sustenance of community. From alienation to the building and sustenance of community. Thus, talking and discussing about issues across individual and group differences is fundamentally important. The engagement of these pillars in curriculum occur and take place informed by, before I get to the vision statement, informed by 3 programs within the organization. One program is the Alumni Ex-Offenders Association, which is, as the label of the program suggests, a program focused on former felons returning to society. Second program is Fight for Lifers. Fight for Lifers focuses on the family members of individuals serving life sentences. In the state of Pennsylvania, life means life. You are carried out in a pine box. They are only now initiating some manner of gubernatorial appeal for potential clemency and potentially in the slow process of moving toward consideration of some manner of probatory or parole statute. But generally speaking, currently, life means life in the state of Pennsylvania. So that leaves a great deal of damage for the families who are left behind. Fight for Lifers focuses on addressing those concerns for the families and the children that Professor Wakefield and others are exploring. Okay, and then the third of the programs is LEAD, Leadership, Education, Advocacy, and Development, LEAD. LEAD is the Youth Prevention Initiative Program, focusing on the children of those who are incarcerated and other members of the community, other youth within the community. There are a set of entrepreneurial and other civic engagement initiatives so that those children are given pro-social environments of support to move their lives forward and challenge the school to prison pipeline through the LEAD Prevention Initiative. Those 3 programs are guided by a vision statement toward community capacity building that says, regardless of one's past, we value each voice being informed by equal access to education, legal rights, health care, and comprehensive political participation. We recognize the excellence in every human being and facilitate a process where our members, along with members of allied organizations, value their own potential. The organization seeks to nurture genius, everyday genius in the ways that that everyday genius resting in all of us. When this is true, that person is prevented from becoming a commodity to be auctioned off by the prison industrial complex. And the manifestations of success, I could have a listing of a slide of some numbers that back up the success rate of Reconstruction, and there are a couple from the original cohort of the within prison program of the original 24 individuals who at the time were facing their third strike. There was the use of the baseball metaphor. If you get the third strike, then you're facing the life sentences with 3 felonious convictions. First, second, third strike. Third strike, the third felonious conviction, leading to a life sentence. So we purposefully sampled a group of individuals who were facing their third strike. They had 2 felonious convictions, and if they were convicted again, would be facing life. And all individuals successfully were released. 20 of the 24, 10 years after release, had successfully desisted. 1 had passed away, and only 2 of the 24 returned to an incarceration due to new convictions. So that's quality success relative to the 5-year typical recidivism rate, within 3 to 5, meaning return to prison after release within a 3 to 5 year window. The typical recidivism rate is 67%. The success rate of Reconstruction's curriculum initiative was 20 of the 24. So quality success, and there's a recent initiative, I could get into those data for another data point of success as well. So just to give you a sense of the felt experience, and I'll close here, of the felt experience of what Reconstruction does for the former felons themselves. Speaking to one, Dion Morrison, who was the co-founder of the Alumni Ex-Offender Association and an intergenerational member, because while Dion was locked up himself, his son was a member and affiliate of the LEAD Youth Prevention Program and is now moving forward with LEAD. So there's an intergenerational component and member and affiliation that is actually beneficial and healthy. Dion reflected at one point in the data collection, it's truly amazing to me, the selflessness of the participating individuals of Reconstruction. Haven't run across anything else like it. The ability to pull together and assist in any way possible, to just give. If Reconstruction put in any time or effort with an individual, they only ask that that individual come back and do something likewise that was given to them for the next person coming through the doors. The nature of sacred exchange, rooted in the principle of reciprocity. Sacred exchange, the giving and the receiving. So, policies and possibilities, many. We can discuss this in the Q&A. I just want to acknowledge a few. It is my hope and point of advocacy. This is part personal, part professional. A recognition, decriminalization and drug diversions are a good thing. I am personally an advocate of a sober, substance-free life. That's a personal choice, but I am all for mass decriminalization and a profound reduction in the abusive and unsuccessful war on drugs. U.S. interdiction is a joke. Over 90% of what we're attempting to presumably prevent gets in anyway. The DEA and the ATF, whatever their intended function, it's primarily symbolic. It's not functional. Upwards of 92% of what they're seeking to interdict gets through their efforts. It's a sieve. Interdiction doesn't, so interdiction, let's reduce it. And decriminalization and drug diversions, let's enhance those. The closure of private prisons, that's a whole, talk about true commodification, for-profit initiatives that are truly profitizing the meetings of all persons, and we are in the state in which, under Governor Kasich, one of the state prisons was sold to Corrections Corporation of America, an organization that he had financial affiliation with, because Lehman Brothers was the saving fiscal grace of Corrections Corporation of America about a decade ago, and Kasich has ties to Lehman Brothers. That wasn't understood as an overt conflict of interest, but how could it be understood as anything else? So I think there's great worth. We live in that state, in this state of that contradiction, but private prisons en masse are highly problematic, and we can talk about that further as time allows. Reentry begins at entry. Start the process of re-inclusion at the point at which the sentencing has been done. So the means by which the re-engagement of individuals to affiliation and whole citizenship begins while they are serving whatever length of sentence they are serving. The National Hire Network is an initiative, is a collaboration of prospective employers who are willing to hire former felons. We know from the work of Diva Pager and others that there is a profound stigma for returning citizens, such that white individuals comparably packaged in resumes, white individuals with a criminal record are more employable than African Americans without a criminal record. So the nature of the stigma and a national hire network is one means through which those disparities of reentry can be successfully addressed. And then must end the school to prison pipeline. There are profound racial disparities in the use both of corporal punishment and the use of suspension and expulsion. Profound disparities from district to district, from 2 to 11 times for similar offenses, meaning African Americans relative to their white counterparts for similar situations are 2 to 11 times more likely, depending upon jurisdiction, to experience at the risk of expulsion from school, long-term suspension or expulsion from school. So ending the school to prison pipeline, fundamentally important to do. Okay, and what else? We'll continue the dialogue, and I look forward to your question and answers as we move this consideration of a possible future forward. Let us picture a world without prisons. Let's just raise the question, what might that world look like? And then begin, once we have, the old African proverb says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. So let us have a sense of possible vision, and then move toward building an infrastructure toward the realization of that vision. I look forward to this dialogue between us being a part of that solution. Thanks for your time and attention.
Think happy thoughts for just a second. What is that? It's your choice. One and one, and just this. Right from the beginning, just in case you guys. Yeah?
Hello. So I now realize I might be a bit of a buzzkill, and so maybe I should have gone first and should have lifted you up. I greatly enjoyed that. So I'm going to talk a bit about mass incarceration and inequality, especially as it relates to children of incarcerated parents, and it is a bit more of a buzzkill, but I also want to end on, I'm going to steal your line, imagining that world without prison, so I swear we'll end there, at least in our discussion. I was asked to think about this question of when does inequality matter. I was recently at the ASA meetings with my partner, who's a criminologist by training, and a friend of ours was going off to a talk called Inequality Matters, and he commented that talk for sociologists should be just called things sociologists think are self-evident. So for sociologists, inequality matters all the time, everywhere, as Townsend said, and in every place. And so I want to think about what mass incarceration and the prison system more generally means in terms of inequality. So where does it reflect already existing inequality, and where does it create more? And there are some places in which it simply reflects existing inequalities that get sort of sucked in to the criminal justice system, and in other ways it creates and sustains further inequalities. So this you've seen, this was the incarceration rate up until about the middle 1970s. A fun story for criminologists is that an eminent criminologist at the time developed a theory about sort of Western civilizations and argued that the incarceration rate in those societies should hover at about 100 per 100,000. So as he was running around the country giving that presentation, this happened. And I bring that up, and I don't name him. The criminologists in the room will know who I'm talking about. But just simply to say that sociologists and criminologists, no one was running around in 1970 predicting this, right? It wasn't something that I think people saw on the radar, and it frankly took us 2 decades to notice. And so if you look at scholarship on mass incarceration, much of it is about in the last 10 to 15 years in terms of a lot of people devoting their scholarly attention to that. So I think in many ways we have a long way to go. And it's been so nice for me and others to see this question of interest to such a broad audience and an interdisciplinary one. Okay, so you saw the international comparisons. The other thing to know, which the prior talk told you quite well, is that there's massive racial disparities in being bound up in the criminal justice system. So if we think about people being incarcerated by the age of 30 or arrested by the age of 23 in those sort of crime-prone years, there are massive disparities today. The other estimate that I think most people pay attention to is the degree to which race and low educational attainment interact to conspire, essentially, to put people within the purview of the criminal justice system. So this is the statistic that a lot of people pay attention to is this one that's bolded on the bottom, which is essentially that for black men who dropped out of high school, it is more likely than not, if they were coming of age in the prison boom, that they will spend time in prison. And that's a massive change in the life course of our population. And so that's kind of where I took off in terms of my work. And so what I want to suggest to you today is that mass incarceration and prisons and the larger sort of surveillance structure, we're talking mostly about prisoners today, but in fact there are massive numbers of people also under supervision, under surveillance, by parole and probation, or by police officers in their communities. And so we're not just talking about prisoners, we're talking about this broader population. So mass incarceration both reflects that, right? It reflects the sort of over and under policing of particular neighborhoods. It reflects a society that has decided to essentially sort of do away with the safety net, and the prisons kind of soak up all the people that we're not quite sure how to help or what to do with. And I think it's exactly right that this is part of a historical legacy. And so mass incarceration can't really be understood if you start in 1970, right? You have to start in 1770, and then it starts to make sense. I also, though, think that there are some instances in which mass incarceration is directly involved in the creation of inequality, and I want to talk to you about that one today. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of research on mass incarceration and inequality, and to give you a sense of sort of where prisons are reflecting inequality and where prisons are creating it. So I'm going to talk very briefly about labor market outcomes and earnings, marriage and divorce, and then parental incarceration, which is my area of research. I'm not going to talk about the math. I'm not going to talk about sort of how the estimates came to be. I'm more than happy to answer questions about them. But all of this material comes from a book that I wrote with a colleague of mine, Chris Wildeman. It's called Children of the Prison Boom, and I'm more than happy to give you those estimates. So what do we know? Well, we know the lifetime risk of imprisonment is unequally distributed. We know that the effects of imprisonment on individuals are often very large. But the effects on inequality in terms of direct creation of inequality are often quite small. So let me give you an example. So black men are 8 times more likely to go to prison relative to white men, and it causes, at the individual level, a 30% reduction in lifetime earnings after that. But it increases inequality between black men and white men by only 3%. Okay, so you have a big individual level effect, and then you have a not big aggregate level effect, and I'll walk you through why that is so for earnings. Marriage is similar. So black men are 8 times more likely to go to prison than white men. It causes a 20% reduction in the chance of marrying, but it increases marriage inequality between blacks and whites by only 4%. So again, another example of a very large individual level effect, a very small aggregate level effect. Why is this? These are 2 examples of incarceration reflecting inequality and not creating it. And what's happening is that the effects of inequality are constrained by the starting distribution. So men who go to prison are at the very low end of the earnings distribution, and so even an effect size of, say, 30% is very small in the aggregate, because you're already talking about a population of people who are often unemployed or in low quality work and in low paying work. And so the prison, if you think about things that way, the prison isn't, among the many things that a prison is doing, yes, it's responding to crime, but I would argue that's not mostly what it's doing. Mostly what it's doing is housing idle people. It is housing people who, for whatever reason, because of prior inequalities, have not been able to make headway into the educational system, into the labor market, and we have made a choice. We've said we're not going to provide supports for some segments of the population. We're going to soak them up into prisons, right? That's one world in which we can live in, and that's the world we're living in. So under these kinds of conditions, inequality can only increase by a small amount, even in the presence of very large differences in rates of imprisonment and very large individual level effects. So scholars have looked at all sorts of incarceration effects, right? And some of them look like this. Some of them don't, and I want to tell you about one that looks very different. I want to be clear, though. I was writing this talk on the plane, and I told some of you my seatmate looked at this slide. She was reading over my shoulder, and she picked a fight with me. And I thought, oh gosh, I really need to explain this better. I'm not saying that incarceration doesn't matter or is unproblematic, right? What I'm saying is that if all of the harms and vulnerabilities and inequalities have happened prior to entering prison, it's difficult for prison to create more, right? So of course incarceration matters. So I'm not suggesting it's unproblematic, but I am suggesting that it has a complicated relationship to aggregate level inequality. So parental incarceration, this is where what I want to focus on. So here's where prisons matter a lot. In this case, black children are 13 times more likely to experience the incarceration of a father relative to white children. And this experience, quite apart from all of the other vulnerabilities or disadvantages those children may have experienced prior to the incarceration of a father, causes additional problems. It causes a 5% increase in behavioral problems, a 25% increase in aggression, a 97% increase in the risk of childhood homelessness. And notably, this effect is only there for black children. White children are buffered from that harm. We can talk about why in the Q&A. And most troubling to me, a 48% increase in the risk of infant mortality in the first year. So these are massive harms that result directly from experiencing the incarceration of a father. And why is, this is troubling for a multitude of reasons, but I think, the way that if we sort of think about what kids are potential, and kids are hope, and kids are the future, and all of that. And so we're talking about a population of children who may have been subject to vulnerabilities prior to this experience, who may have other sorts of issues, but this experience in a child who's barely started life, right? Maybe we're talking about infants or 5-year-olds or 8-year-olds. That's a real knock, and that's where you start to see very large relationships to inequality. So a collaborator and I did these estimates, and we said, okay, so how has racial inequality in child well-being changed during the prison boom? And what we saw was, in particular, homelessness rates, child homelessness rates for Black children have gone up quite a lot during the prison boom. There has not been a great explanation for why. Infant mortality rates have also gone up, or at least stayed stable in the United States, despite massive amounts of money directed at reducing them. The United States, for all our wealth, has a bizarrely high infant mortality rate, and it's especially resistant to intervention. And so what we essentially thought was, gee, I wonder if this massive prison population had anything to do with any of this. And so, again, I'm not going to go through the math of it, but what we did was we took those risk estimates that I showed you earlier and said, okay, so if Black children are X times more likely to experience this and the individual level effect is Y, how much of the child well-being race gap does mass imprisonment explain? So we looked at the percent change in all of these problems. IMR is the infant mortality rate. And we said, okay, what's the percent change in these problems for a kid who has a parent incarcerated? So these are the estimates I just gave you. Then we said, okay, what's the black-white gap when there's no incarceration? So essentially, we had a bunch of data sets, and we said, what's the gap between Black and white children for all kids who've never had a parent incarcerated, right? And that was our baseline. And so there's still a racial gap that is not due to incarceration, right? Racial gaps are around, you can study racial gaps in all sorts of things. They arise for a multitude of reasons, but we were trying to isolate what's due to incarceration. So we developed this baseline estimate, and then we said, okay, so what's the percent change in race gaps that can be attributed to the experience of parental incarceration? And we get very big estimates. We get estimates like the experience of parental incarceration explains 10% of total behavioral problems, up to a high of 65% of the risk of child homelessness. And in another paper that my collaborator has written, he essentially shows that the increase, especially among Black children, in the risk of childhood homelessness is almost entirely due to mass incarceration, which is really troubling. Other people have done work on HIV rates among Black women and have shown that those are almost entirely due to racial concentrations related to incarceration. So I think the way to think of the prison system is to think of it as this place that kind of hides all of our social problems and also creates more, right? And I think the other sort of perversion with mass incarceration is that the rates of mass incarceration are stunningly high. The number of people we have in prison is stunningly high. But the experience is so concentrated that in some communities, the rates are very high, and then for other communities, it's a completely invisible social problem. So there's a great paper in the Du Bois Review by Hetty Lee and colleagues, and she uses survey data to get a sense of how many people have a family member in prison. And so the numbers are something like 44% of Black women can name at least one family member who is currently in prison, not just has ever, but currently. And the numbers for whites are things like 3%, 5%, these are very small numbers. And so I think the other thing to pay attention to here is that this is a social problem that is highly consequential and visible and damaging for some groups and ignorable unless you want to pay attention for lots of others. And that I think is really troubling. So the conclusion we come to in the book and in this work is that mass incarceration has widened inequality in childhood well-being in really troubling ways. I think these consequences are particularly perverse because they fall on the most vulnerable of children and they make things worse. And I think anything that kind of derails a kid before they've even started out in life is particularly troubling. So I think the other thing to pay attention to is that even if the imprisonment rate, and here's where I get to be a complete buzzkill, return to 100 per 100,000 tomorrow, the ripple effects and these sort of harms that have passed on to children are likely to continue for at least one more generation. So figuring out how to handle that, I think, is difficult. I want to end with a couple of quotes, and they're not as positive as where Townsend ended. So many of you, I end with Michelle Alexander. I actually have really mixed feelings about this book, and I'd love to talk about the war on drugs and sort of what that means in the Q&A. But I think it's quite right when she refers to the sort of prison system and its difficulties. One, she refers to it as a caste system in its consequences, and I think that's a metaphor we could maybe think a little bit about and debate a little bit. And then also, yesterday the idea of how does justice relate to choice? And how does equity relate to choice? And the sort of odd thing about the incarceration rate and mass imprisonment is this idea, well, people choose to commit crimes, right? And that's why they're locked up or locked out. And it is the case that prisons are not filled with millions of thousands of innocent people. But it is the case that all of us break the law. Many of us do so every day and don't get caught. And so I think when we think about who ends up in prison, it's certainly much more complicated than that. So even this idea about choice, yesterday the comment was choosing to jump off a bridge. Lots of us make bad choices, but we don't give up our lives and those of our families for the duration. And I do think, a society that is okay with incarcerating this many people and seeing those harms passed on through generations is one that I'm not particularly comfortable living in, and so I think that's something to think about as well. Many thanks, and I'm happy to answer questions, and if you email me, I'm also happy to give you any of these stats or any of the papers that produce them. Thank you.
All right, sticking with the theme of the new Jim Crow, could both of our panelists, could you speak to the power and the problems with the new Jim Crow metaphor?
Do you wanna, so I love the metaphor. I think it's quite right historically. I think it's quite right to think about, you referenced Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, who says, look, the system is operating as it should, and what it is doing is the same thing that Jim Crow was doing and the same thing that slavery was doing. So I'm very much in agreement on that line of thinking. My concern about the new Jim Crow is actually related to really boring stuff like data. And so for example, she talks about most of the growth in prisons being related to drug convictions. So that's true in the federal system, which is 13% of the prison population. It's not true in the state system. In state prisons, the majority of people are there for violent crimes. If you let out every drug offender in every prison in this country, we would still have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And so I think the war on drugs is absolutely a major part of it. But I also worry that if we sort of bracket drugs, which I think, again, is incredibly important, if we bracket that, gosh, that leaves a whole lot of other people sitting in prison who may have made just horrendous choices, done something awful at 19. But I think it brackets this larger question of, when do people get a second chance? When are they done paying? And so I worry a little bit about the policy proposals that come out of the new Jim Crow, because it lets us ignore a pretty big population. So that's my concern about it. I'm curious kind of what you think.
Yeah, great book. For those who haven't read it, please do. Michelle has done some terrific work with that text. I want to start within the book. She starts from the personal and then engages the political in a very thoughtful way. Mm-hmm. And to further that dialogue, what is the personal, how did the personal and political meet? And she chronicles a particular moment as an ACLU lawyer running to a particular thing that she was trying to get to, excuse me, she comes upon a flyer on a telephone pole. And it talks about a church meeting to call attention to racial disparities in incarceration. Just that moment of it, she's a big ticket lawyer with this long-standing social justice organization. And she takes us to an intimate, she was rustling, and she looks up and sees, just the use of that ethnographic moment, I think, has great poignancy. So I just want to call attention to the value of how she chooses to center the start of her book. And then she moves in to the macro very thoughtfully. She also, I want to celebrate also how she ends. She ends the book focusing on the need for a social justice movement. And she uses a critical data point feeding on what Sarah has mentioned. One of them is she suggests that the drug war could have been fought anywhere. It could have been fought in college dormitories. It could have been fought adjacent to the Ohio Union, wherever I'm pointing. Right? It could have been fought in suburban high school parking lots, but it wasn't. So she calls attention to the racialization of the metaphor by talking about where it actually wasn't, to Sarah's critical point of the ways in which for the prison system as a system can be invisible among whites, among large segments of whites, absolutely invisible. Now among working class whites, fundamentally, but among large segments of whites, completely invisible. So in that sense, the new Jim Crow as metaphor is thoughtfully applied. I sort of bristle at the idea of, are we giving proper, and this gets weird, let me step out of it because I need to manage my emotions. In the process of preparing for this, I went back to some historical images related to lynching and looked at lynching data. And it's plentiful if one would choose to access it. I need to be careful about the ways in which I expose myself to it. I think everybody should, because the psychosocial damage is profound when you see those images. But the reason, if we use the new, that's Jim Crow. That's that was the extreme of the Jim Crow era, when the commodification of the black body turned into the black codes, and the black codes, legal statutes of second-class citizenship. We understand them through the lens of the civil rights movement in terms of getting to the back of the bus and the need to, and then the Montgomery bus boycott in '54 and the initiation thereof. But it's rooted in Supreme Court statute, Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896, where there was a recognition of the separate but equal statute. And they knew that it was separate and profoundly unequal. So when I think of Jim Crow, the severity, the intensity, the widespread breadth, it's just, my fear is a bit, I want to be respectful of the magnitude and enormity of the damage, spiritual and otherwise, that were associated with that era. And if we apply that metaphor too liberally or too broadly, then I think it loses a level of historical respect that I think that period of history of its actual engagement deserves. So it's not that not that it's not apt. It is, because it is creating a meaningful reinforcement of second-class citizenship. She talks about what is denied, what access to resources individuals are denied upon reentry. You can't gain access to student loans. You can't be in Section 8 housing. You can't apply for, depending on jurisdiction, you can't apply for food stamps. You cannot apply for, so under certain situation after situation, it denies reentering former felons access to a means toward moving their citizenship forward. That's what so in that sense, yes, it's an apt metaphor. But historical severity, salience, and all that sort of stuff matters. And I just hope we acknowledge both the truths of its accuracy and place it in its proper historical light, because it was severe and it was ugly. during, when Jim Crow was, the old Jim Crow was not pleasant. And there were some significant lynching incidents in the state that we reside in, which, another conversation for another day. But yeah, Jim Crow's very icky.
Thank you. You brought up a point about the psychosocial damage of seeing the images from, let's say, the old Jim Crow, right? But how has the killing of unarmed black men impacted that psychosocial damage today? We've seen videos now. You see Terrence Crutcher, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. What kind of psychosocial damage do you think is being played from that?
Oh, I'm in one of the social justice organizations that I'm affiliated with. An individual who I interact with on a regular basis was crying at the end of a meeting, and she was reflecting on her 7-year-old grandchild had come home from school, and he was just shaking. And he said to her, Mama, I'm not sure, Netta, I'm not sure that I want to go outside. And I was just like, and it was powerful to hear her recount that. She was, when a 7-year-old kid has to think about the safety of going outside, that's the damage is meaningful. So I think that there's, I'm not sure again how to use the metaphor. There is a researcher who is suggesting there is a malady, a challenge called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And the idea of that is that the era of chattel slavery itself has an echo effect generations down the road. So if we speak of the significance of that we're 6 to 7, depending on how you count, generations away from, then certainly the visibility of CNNs and MSNBCs and the nightly news, and the 13-year-old Tyree King kid who was just in this city. I'm not sure how you measure it. So the answer to your question is profound, I would say. And I only have anecdotal evidence. I don't have any, psychosocial data to back it up. But anecdotally, it's problematic. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to question the safety of riding his bike down the street. It just shouldn't happen, even in a challenging neighborhood.
Just for a sense of audience participation, think about your 7-year-old self right now, just by a show of hands. How many of you had to fear going outside? Nobody here, right? So think about the current state of affairs today. We're talking about 7-year-olds fearing to go outside, especially in Columbus, Ohio, right? Because Columbus is a pretty good city for the most part. I'm putting quotes around that, right? So think about those realities, all right? My next question, sticking with the children, is the school to prison pipeline. We have this zero tolerance policies in schools, which often result in suspensions, expulsions, and in some cases arrests. What are some of the solutions that we can come to combat this issue, and what positive models exist that we can possibly frame?
So I have a student writing her dissertation on that very topic, and so I've read all that recently because she gave me a draft. It's really tricky. I recently, my high school in my neighborhood, which is just outside Newark, had an incident where a student brought a gun to school, and everyone predictably freaked out, and the town cut a librarian in order to bring a cop into the school, and my partner and I went to a school board meeting and said, please don't do this, and gave them all the research on why that was a bad idea. And happily, they decided not to bring the cop in. I think what's really hard, though, is that there's actually really good research on how you have safe and healthy schools without resorting to zero tolerance sorts of policies, which don't work. So this student of mine is showing that when you expel and suspend and expel kids from school, you actually drive up the neighborhood crime rate around this. So it's, it actually makes things worse for everybody.
including the student who's expelled. But there's lots of great research that essentially talks about how to do school discipline in a smart way, but it's hard. It's creating a culture of consistency, right? It's figuring out how to deal with many of the problems we have in every other space, which is what do you do in schools where there's a lot of class diversity and race diversity, and students don't necessarily connect across race and class lines? How do you create a community within that school? And that takes a very long time, but there are certainly many successful programs that are able to do it. The nice thing, though, is I do think like mass incarceration and some of these problems, my sense is that schools are slowly turning away from those kinds of policies, just as we're slowly turning away from these sort of punitive criminal justice policies. So I think there's reason for optimism.
Yeah, I would very much share that sentiment. Zero tolerance doesn't work. Zero tolerance magnifies inequalities. So I would say, in answer to the question, remove zero tolerance as a strategy in K through 12 education. It reinforces and magnifies a variety of inequalities. Second, the criminalization of youth is happening within the schools. So, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I'll date myself. The detention person who hung around my school was this retired guy. He was sort of a matronly, very approachable guy, and everybody was sort of running. He was respected because he had cultivated a quality relationship. Now we have folks with guns in schools, and I'm not sure that the criminalization, that the whole metal detector thing, and the folks with guns in schools, that is criminalizing youth before they've committed a crime. Now, how we manage that in terms of the creation of safety is a point of discussion worth having. But I have a relative who teaches in a large city school system, and she in a challenging school setting, and she is fundamentally against the use of metal detectors because she feels, and she does it from a profoundly Christian sensibility, she would say, it removes them further from the place of understanding the God within themselves. She would say something like that. But the point, so in terms of that, end of zero tolerance, more effective management of the way that we criminalize youth, especially in school settings, and enhancing the use of restorative justice practices to mediate conflicts among students. Restorative justice practices are the engagement, not the retributive system rooted in the Old Testament eye for an eye stuff that is our current carceral model, but a restorative, a shared fate outcome, rooted in the use of a circle. Folks, the victim and the perpetrator sit in a circle, and the persons have to speak about the ways in which they engage the damage, think about their motives, and then the individual who's the victim is a direct participant in meting out whatever shared agreement, communal agreement of punishment has come to. There's been quality success in school district after school district, in Portland, in Minneapolis, in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the use of these restorative justice models in K through 12. Excuse me, that research is from Schiff and Gordon Bazemore, focusing on high schools. But restorative justice practices to create a more caring and collective justice participatory model within K through 12 education.
Thank you. So when we talk about models, this notion of nonviolent offenders taking up a good portion of the incarcerated, right? How can public support get behind this effort of trying to reduce that number?
They are. Well, I mean, I think if you, and it's really depressing because criminal justice reform, at least at the federal level, died on Friday in the Senate, and yet you know, that's with bipartisan agreement, that's with polls showing that Americans don't want to pursue this strategy anymore, that's with, gosh, the Koch brothers on board, right? So I think I think it's much more difficult at the federal level. Happily, though, dismantling mass incarceration doesn't happen at the federal level. It happens in the states, and states as different as Texas and New York are all doing great things. I mean, Oklahoma has a number of referendums on the ballot to decriminalize drugs, to changing the way that they classify some property crimes so that they remain misdemeanors rather than felonies. You know, and so these are on I think it's, I've never been a fan of ballot referenda because that's how we got we got 3 strikes from that, but apparently now we're getting the anti-3 strikes, and so I think you see that happening, and it's been interesting to see how far behind the curve the Senate is.
Yeah, do what you can where you are. I mean, I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of movies. There was a movie many years ago, The Year of Living Dangerously, and a character named Billy Kwan says, "Do what you can where you are. If there's a concern that you have, figure what is your sphere of influence? Who can you engage? Is it an op-ed piece kind of issue? Is it an organizational affiliation issue? Is it just sharing dialogue among those you know? Is it going to your place of worship or secular affiliation that you value? Is it where are you? And what is the and move forward from where you are with the concerns that you value. I need to be clear. Mass incarceration, I would take the position, devalues all of our lives. All of our lives. Back to point 7. This is a cultural and societal concern, even when one can be invisible to it, because it really devalues all of our lives. In the work, I'm struck by this particular image, and I keep coming back to it, because it's very similar to the work of my mentors, Ruth Peterson and Lori Crevo, in their book, Divergent Social Worlds. They actually use an image not unlike this on the cover of their book, Divergent Social Worlds. And just to celebrate that work and this imagery, they emphasize that residential segregation, when you look at, let's see, I don't want to get into the details of how they came to generate their data, but fascinating, elegant data that they use. The National Neighborhood Crime Study, it was phenomenal data. But it allowed them to explore various factors that inform crime rate change. And they found that a 1 standard deviation unit change in residential segregation increases violent crime in all neighborhood types. Predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly African American neighborhoods, predominantly Latino neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods, and integrated neighborhoods. And I can talk about the distinction, but across all neighborhood types, an incremental change in residential segregation increases violent crime in all neighborhoods. So what we need, that's an acknowledgement that residential segregation furthers crime as a detriment, increasing the risk of victimization regardless of the neighborhood you reside in. So there's work, so you can only protect yourself so far. How many gates of the gated community can you create? One might ask. So I just want to acknowledge that I just acknowledge that to say, this is a problem that we all share, and I don't mean to conflate. Residential segregation has its own set of complications. I just want to acknowledge that we are all in this to some degree. So to answer your question, there's reason for concern, and the possibilities for improvement, a broader social justice, is available to us all. Do something to engage the solution. There's a poet that I like a lot, in Hakeem El-Abudi, and he talks, think generations. We're thinking generations. Whether we have birth children or not, our children's 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 children, what world are we leaving for them? The folks we're guaranteed not to meet. What are we doing now to further. Yeah, I'm very much with Professor Wakefield's concern. Even if there were even if there was a profound shift, the generational effects will take a long time to actually reduce, but we are all agents of change. We can all do something. Think generations and engage with others in fellowship toward a broader justice in ways that you value.
Thank you. And I pose that question so that we can begin to think about in which ways we can be engaged. I'm not sure if any of you know Dr. Patricia Cunningham II. She's over the social change unit over in Student Life, and she brings males from the youth detention centers to campus. I was kind of, in awe about this program. Like, how the hell did they get out of the youth detention center to come to campus? But it's kind of like this, Buckeye for a Day type piece, and we talk about, what does it mean to be a man? And I think that, for me, that was a way to kind of get involved. I work with black males, particularly those at the graduate level and student athletes, but rarely have I had these discussions with, brothers who are incarcerated 17, 18 years old. So there are ways of being engaged, and I really want to encourage us to do that, because as we said, there are collateral consequences to this piece on mass incarceration. And so when we talk about, this is my last one before we open up for those in attendance, and speaking to having the babies, as she calls them, come to campus, right? This piece on addressing recidivism. What are some of the issues that kind of create this ongoing revolving door of guys having this back into incarceration, rather? Recidivism is essentially it.
Yeah, I mean,
You may be, go ahead.
well, there is work that focuses on the correlates of increased risk of return. But let me acknowledge, since it's connected to the earlier critique. Within Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, one of the reasons that she uses it as metaphor is she emphasizes what statutes have been imposed reduce the likelihood of successful reentry. When it's not possible for an individual to return to Section 8 housing, when it makes illegal the mere presence of an individual who is a former felon on site of many Section 8 residential facilities, meaning that the family, even if they visit, even if they visit, the family's Section 8 statute can be revoked. That has family consequences, economic consequences, homelessness consequences that are profound. That's a statute that she suggests needs to be revisited and likely changed so that so the one, access to food stamps, access to student loans, access to means through which individuals can be returning citizens. These are among the things of voting access. We are in a state, Ohio, that allows individuals to be voter eligible upon release, so they can be on probation and parole. We have states in the union, thankfully only 2, where with a felonious conviction, you can never vote again. And then we have 2 states, intriguingly enough, we have 2 states, Vermont and Maine, where individuals who are currently incarcerated can vote. Maine and Vermont incarcerated folks are going to vote in this presidential election. So maybe Maine and Vermont are a model. But the point is, 46 of the 50 states are somewhere in between those 2 extremes. 2 states that say felonious conviction, never. Again, 2 states that say even while incarcerated for whatever reason, you still vote. And then 46 states that are somewhere in between. So that's another means. Point. Recidivism would go down if these individuals have pro-social affiliations. Enhance the pro-social affiliations in as many diverse means. Obviously employment, obviously housing regularity, obviously some form of familial mediation and family reconciliation. Those are absolutely vital if reentry is to be successful and desistance is to be extended and recidivism is to decline. Those are.
I would just second that that the system isn't set up for recidivism rates to be low, right? So it's set up to punish people, and it's set up to keep punishing them long after they leave the system. And so if the win is punishing people well, we're winning, right? But it's not designed to. You would not design a system this way if rehabilitation and recidivism were on the menu of goals. And I think that's the point, and that these constellation of disadvantages that follow you make it really difficult to ever leave it. On that happy note.
We gotta start coming to you first. That's a joke. We wanna open it up now for the Q&A for the audience.
I have a question for Townsend. The data from Philadelphia. And so if that were a randomized control intervention, re-entry intervention, what would have been some of the interventions that led to the resiliency, reciprocity, whatever that could be? You ran through it so fast, I couldn't catch it.
With you, really appreciate your question, Daryl. Daryl's question harkens back, for those who weren't here yesterday, the idea of best practices as a sort of health intervention model and policy engagement model was raised by Professor Wilkinson in his spirit level keynote address. And I'm with your question. What would be great would be to have, I actually proposed, and it hasn't gotten funded on 2 occasions. I've proposed a model similar to what you're suggesting. So there could be an effective match sample design where individuals of with a similar carceral history are randomly selected into a model like a reconstruction affiliation, and then more traditional reentry participations, and then contrast the meanings of affiliation along those lines. I can speak about what we no such data. Well, I'm not aware of any data that are that elegant. To your question, what works is engaging pro-social affiliation. So, at point of, within the last, with the first cohort, within the last 18 months of, these were individuals serving meaningful sentences of 5 years or more. And within at the point at which they started their 18-month to date of release, that's when the within prison curriculum of reconstruction actually began. So for the individuals selected in the cohort, there were a set of workshops where what was described earlier is taken into prison settings. So everything from public speaking, where they are trained to speak publicly, as well as having public speakers come in. Spiritual engagement across the faith continuum. There's a recognition, whether one is atheist, whether one is Buddhist, Muslim, across the Christian spectrum, across those affiliative differences, there are different discussions about faith affiliation, so that a Muslim will talk about the meaning of being Muslim across all members of the cohort. So it's not just speaking to Muslims. So there's enrichment of the faith dialogue. There's family affiliation to bring the family members to the prison setting well before the release. So the process of family re-engagement begins formally. One of the critical predictors, back to the earlier question, one of the critical predictors of successful desistance is just having one family member on a visitor list. That's a meaning. The individuals who are most likely to recidivate are individuals who don't have individuals who they feel comfortable enough to actually list as a member on their visiting list. So it's a set of pro-social affiliations that begin within the last set of months prior to their release. And then then upon their release, there's a transition because there's work from from a Savoy data set that actually tracked reentering persons. That first 72 hours is vital, is just vital. What's happening there? Who are they actually released to? Who's there to visit them when the doors open? Is there somebody on their side so that they know? That has a huge difference. There are a set of transitional pro-social affiliations that take place, and then sorry, this is too long, but then longer standing associations through the 3 programs that I described that are centered in the ones that you described, that are centered in the Alumni Ex-Offenders Association.
Okay. Question here to the left?
I don't know if you've seen the TV special on Norway prisons, but they treat their prisoners humanely. Is that something we can strive for? Is that possible to get here someday?
I hope so. I'm actually off to visit prisons in Denmark and the Netherlands in a couple weeks, and it's absolutely the case that I mean, the doors aren't locked. People are good to one another, and I do think that at the end of the day, treating people humanely is helpful, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it also helps for recidivism, right? That it's not helpful to take people away from the things that make them attached to others, and I think treating people inhumanely in prison is part of that problem. I have not found, correctional officials, though, constantly speak to safety in prison, right? And so they say, well, we couldn't do that. But I've never seen anyone who can tell me why the good prisoners of Denmark are so different than the good prisoners in the United States. And I just don't think as a country we've ever cared how other people are doing it. And but again, I see those conversations. I think, the discussion about closing Rikers in New York and the conditions there, I think it's very much paralleling the discussions about policing and its legitimacy and what that means going forward. So I'm much more optimistic than I was a few years ago, as sad and horrifying as all of this has been to witness.
Just to connect to the, excuse me, your question, Mayor de Blasio was just on, Mayor of New York, was just on, I think it was CNBC, recently, and he was talking about the suspending the use of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk was a policy that was where individuals could be stopped and frisked by New York Police officers with no probable cause. And what it instituted was a profound racialization where African American and Latino young men were 90% of the persons who were stopped and frisked. And less than 10% of those had any, meaning less than 10% of the individuals who were stopped and frisked had anything, any drug, anything, any paraphernalia, anything. So it was a bad, and Mayor de Blasio was talking about the how, with a more humane policy of police engagement with citizenry, crime has continued to go down. So he was making that point. When you treat individuals more humanely, crime actually goes down. So why not do so in the total institutions in which the individuals who are the law violators are being housed? Same idea definitely applies, and there's evidence to suggest that. Absolutely.
Yes.
So, back in August, the Department of Justice released this thing that's saying they're trying to get rid of these for-profit prisons. But I don't know much more about that decision other than they released that. I read this thing and I'm like, okay, so that's federal prisons. Does that mean all the private-run prisons in Ohio are going to go away now? Or what do you guys make of that? What are your thoughts on this Department of Justice announcing this weird
So I think the federal level sets the tone. Others would argue with me about that, but I think it's also, the federal government also announced that it would not allow for solitary confinement of juveniles. There are a grand total of 9.5 juveniles in the federal system, right? So this is not a policy that affects a lot of people, but certainly signals a shift. And I believe there's a vote in the House to withhold federal funding from states that house juveniles in solitary confinement. So I think that the federal government is trying to incentivize these sorts of, and the private prisons are troubling not because they affect a lot of people. Most prisoners are in government facilities. They're troubling because they incentivize things like holding people longer, and that they're troubling more symbolically, I think. My sense is that what that's going to look like is people withholding funds to states that continue to do that, and to try and incentivize economically other shifts. But I don't think at that level you get rid of the ones in Ohio.
The reason for hope, the reason for institutional hope. And we know from your Ohio example, the one that was sold, Erie, is the institution that was sold to Corrections Corporation of America. I needed to, immediate overcrowding. They immediately incentivized less humane treatment. They immediately were doubling up beds and assaults, prisoner-to-prisoner assaults, and correctional officer to correctional officer assaults doubled. Drug infiltration was significant. Anecdotally, there was an incident, sorry, it's not funny. Anecdotally, there was an incident in which a duffel bag was thrown over the prison wall full of illegal substances and was able to get into the prison walls and distributed because of the severe reduction of surveillance generally, because the prisoner to correctional officer ratio was incentivized to be more harmful. So at private prisons, you can't, they're just such a bad idea on so many levels. And the one in Ohio was a clear illustration. So I'm with you. It is momentum. When the federal government says, don't renew the contracts, reduce them by 50% within a year, move toward their complete elimination with the private institute, that's hopeful. And the hope is other states will have reason to follow, and maybe the federal government will actually put legal teeth into the reason for them to follow. We can only hope. By the way, there are just some paradoxes related to these institutions. Florida Atlantic University, trying to come up with the big boys in football, considered having the second leading private prison corporation carry the name of their stadium. A new built stadium on a Florida Atlantic University, Atlantic University campus was for a period of time going to be named after the GEO Corporation, which is the second leading private prison company in this country. There was a brouhaha, and it ended up not happening. But I just think it's powerful that there was for that moment an engaging intersection between how should I say this? between high-priced college athletics and college football, and the naming of a stadium on a college campus and a private prison corporation. That didn't happen, but I just think it's telling. Telling. It almost happened. So private prisons are a bad thing. Please write your folks. Please write your politicians. We gotta get rid of them. They're just bad.
Our last question here in the back.
Appreciate this. It's been a fantastic presentation. My question for the panelists is, I think much of this is, I'm generalizing here, but much of white America doesn't see these connections, in my opinion. And anecdotally, I see that with my family and my friends. I'm wondering what
there is research showing that the way academics typically do it is unsuccessful. So whatever would work in your seminar, don't do that. Whatever would get you an A on a paper, don't do that. I think stories and humanizing things. I would. The great thing about the new Jim Crow is that it's a great read, and people want to read it. And for my work, Sesame Street has a resource for children of incarcerated parents, and I've shown it to my in-laws who enjoy Trump, and I think the children are always a good way to get people to care, but it isn't with evidence, and it isn't with debate and argument. I think it's by trying to get people to see how it relates to their own lives. I think it's their people's self-interest, but I honestly have no idea how I would handle that. My family doesn't listen to me. I have a PhD in this, and they don't think I have useful knowledge half the time. So it's very difficult. Do you have thoughts?
Well, I would just celebrate we're all agents of change. I would return to that, and I would value the spiral metaphor. There's a guy named William Germano who has written a book about writing, and he talks about thinking about your audiences in a form of the spiral, where there's a core of your audience that's at the center, and then there are other individuals that radiate out from you. You are at the center of the spiral. Who are you engaging with, and how are you engaging with? I had a conversation similar to this, back to Sarah's point, within my own family, and I'm the youngest of five, and I don't know what among my siblings pay attention to anything that I have to say, and I've been talking about this for years. So I think we're not only are academics unsuccessful, we're unsuccessful in our own families. But no. Sorry, I'm only half joking there. But I'm with you. Sphere of influence. Who are you in fellowship with? And there are a variety of ways. When Professor Alexander talks about the engagement of a broader societal movement, she's talking about the ways in which you carry from this moment. See, I think that I have questions about this kind of environment. To me, there should be returning citizens in the seats. And I'm not asking for raising of hands. Some of us may be returning citizens. But my guess would be the number of returning citizens in this kind of event are small. Let's create environments of dialogue across difference. If this is the ripple, let it radiate out. If this is the cast stone, let the ripples radiate out. Who are you in fellowship with, and how can you engage that dialogue? Maybe it's an op-ed piece. Maybe it's a follow-up to the Daily, talking about your experience of this event, the event as a whole. Maybe it's an engagement with a student organization to talk about how a student-sponsored collective can address the concerns about social inequalities in a new way. What are the ways in which you can carry it off campus in secular and sacred settings? So we are the agents of change, and change can happen. I celebrate your motive and that what initiated the question. Yeah.
That's a beautiful point to end on, too. So I want to thank the panelists for their time and sharing their knowledge, and also for you attending this session as well. The next one will be at 10:45, correct? All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.